So I want you to picture this. It is July 1987, right? We're in New Delhi.
Right.
And the atmosphere is just, I mean, it's incredibly charged. You have this massive multinational peace accord that's about to be signed.
Yeah, an agreement that is entirely designed to end years of just brutal ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka.
Exactly. And the architect of this entire deal is the Indian government. They're bringing, their full geopolitical weight to bear on this.
They absolutely are. But here's the wild part.
Yeah.
In a room just nearby, the leader of the primary armed militant group, the LTTE Velupillai Prabhakaran, he picks up a telephone.
Right. He makes a call back to his commanders in Jaffna.
Exactly. And instead of, discussing the dawn of this brand new peace, he tells them that he fully intends to, quote, teach the Indian Prime Minister a lesson.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's just such a stunning historical detail.
It really is. And it just perfectly encapsulates this massive paradox of conflict resolution, right? Well, you have this formal document, beautifully drafted, ready to be signed by heads of state, and simultaneously the actual guy on the ground whose cooperation is, absolutely essential to making the document work.
He's actively threatening the architect of the whole peace deal.
Precisely.
And that paradox is exactly what we are dissecting today on this deep dive.
Yeah. We're looking at the peace enforcement phase of the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord from the late 1980s.
Right. But we're looking at this strictly through the lens of, strategic analysis and military history. Because this isn't just a story about Sri Lanka or India.
Not at all.
It's basically a masterclass and a very universal, honestly kind of terrifying question, which is why do peace agreements just completely collapse right after the ink dries?
Right. You have a signed accord. You deploy this massive peacekeeping force. The civilian population is just begging for stability.
Yeah, but they're desperate for it.
And yet, within months, the entire region just descends back into full-scale catastrophic war.
So why does that happen?
Well, to understand it, we have to discard this really common assumption that people make. People tend to think that getting the leaders to sign a piece of paper is the finish line.
Right, like the treaty is signed, we can all go home now.
Exactly. But it's not. Agreement success absolutely does not equal implementation success.
So the handshake is really just the starting gun for a much harder race.
That's a great way to put it. Implementation success, actually making the peace survive on the ground, it requires this very specific, incredibly fragile formula.
Okay, let's unpack the formula.
It's trust, plus shared objectives, plus communication, plus security guarantees.
Trust, shared objectives, communication, and security guarantees.
Right. And if any one of those variables drops to zero, the entire equation just collapses.
And what we're going to trace today, based on our sources, is the systematic, almost mathematical failure of every single one of those elements.
Yeah, we are going to watch a textbook transformation. We'll see a celebrated peace process mutate into creeping distrust, then into competing interests.
Then it escalates into this incredibly sophisticated information warfare.
Right, before suffering a total political breakdown and finally ending in the application of massive military force.
That's wild. Okay, before we get into the breakdown, let's set the board for you listening. Because the cast of characters here is, it's incredibly complex.
It really is a crowded board.
Yeah. So you have the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF, who are deployed to enforce this accord.
Right.
Then you have the Sri Lankan government and their armed forces, the SLAF.
Yep.
And on the militant side, you have the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, who are by far the dominant, most heavily armed militant group.
And then, of course, caught entirely in the crossfire of all these armed groups is a really diverse civilian population of Tamils, Sinhalese, and Muslims.
And as always, just a quick reminder for you listening, we are pulling all of this directly from the historical and military source text provided. We're not taking any political sides here.
Absolutely not.
We are just strictly unpacking the strategic realities, the actions, and the perceptions exactly as they're recorded in the source material.
Right. And looking at those realities, every single one of those stakeholders came to the table with entirely different, often totally mutually exclusive objectives.
So if we build a stakeholder matrix for 1987, the initial strategic situation is just this massive knot of competing aims and deep-seated fears.
It's a mess.
So let's map that out. What is India's actual objective in sending its army across the Palk Strait?
For India, the objective was basically regional stability and diplomatic prestige.
Right. This is the Cold War era.
Exactly. They wanted to ensure no hostile foreign powers could gain a foothold in Sri Lanka. And, they wanted to be seen as the undisputed peacemaker of South Asia.
Makes sense. And the Sri Lankan government, what's their main goal?
Their aim is just the fundamental survival of their state. They want their country unified, they want territorial integrity preserved, and they want this violent insurgency in their northern and eastern provinces permanently extinguished.
And meanwhile, you have the Tamil civilian population who, frankly, they just want the shooting to stop.
Yeah, they want physical safety, they want medicine, food, just a return to normal life.
But the LTTE,
Yeah.
this is where the strategic calculus gets really sticky, right?
Mm.
Going back to that phone call in Delhi, why would Prabhakaran agree to sign an accord if he's already planning to sabotage it?
Well, because the LTTE were incredibly reluctant collaborators in this. They were subjected to immense diplomatic pressure to sign the thing.
Right.
But internally, they didn't view this accord as a victory or even like a compromise. They viewed it as a strategic straitjacket.
A straitjacket.
Yeah. The source text actually outlines 5 core apprehensions the LTTE had regarding this peace process. And these aren't just minor political disagreements. I mean, these are existential fears.
Okay, let's dig into these 5 apprehensions, because the first one is just this glaring fundamental contradiction.
It really is. The LTTE's avowed, absolutely non-negotiable objective was achieving Tamil Eelam a fully independent sovereign state.
Right. But the very first clause of the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord explicitly guarantees the territorial integrity of a unified Sri Lanka.
Exactly. So right there you have a fatal collision of shared objectives. The accord literally outlaws the LTTE's entire reason for existing.
Right. If they accept the accord, they're publicly abandoning the exact cause they've been fighting and dying for.
Yeah. And that creates an immediate, just profound psychological crisis within the militant leadership.
Which bleeds directly into their second fear, which is the surrender of their weapons.
Right. The accord mandates that all militant groups have to disarm.
But I mean, to a guerrilla force, a gun isn't just a tool, is it?
No, not at all. It's their identity. It's their sole source of power, their prestige, their leverage. You really have to put yourself in the mindset of an armed cadre here.
Right.
Surrendering weapons to a foreign army, it isn't perceived as a step toward peace. It's perceived as a humiliating public surrender. It's honestly a psychological emasculation.
Wow. So they recognize that if they just handed over their guns, they'd look incredibly weak to their own people.
Exactly. So to counter this loss of prestige, they immediately felt compelled to construct a narrative that India was basically coercing them.
Right. They couldn't be seen as willing participants.
Precisely. They had to play the victim of a larger power.
Okay, I want to focus on the relationship with the local population for a second, because this third apprehension is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, the protector role.
Right. The IPKF arrives in Sri Lanka, and they don't just roll in with tanks and guns. They roll in with massive welfare schemes.
Oh, massive. They're distributing rations, providing medical care, rebuilding infrastructure. They are actively stabilizing the region.
And the local Tamil population naturally responds with immense gratitude.
Because the IPKF is doing exactly what peacekeepers should be doing.
Right. But the LTTE watches this happen, and they just panic.
Total panic. Because for years, the LTTE had built their entire legitimacy on this claim that they were the sole saviors and protectors of the Tamil people.
And now this massive, well-funded foreign army is doing the job infinitely better than they ever could.
Exactly. The LTTE realized they were rapidly being displaced as the primary protector.
It's essentially a corporate hostile takeover, but, played out in a war zone.
A hostile takeover, yeah.
Like, imagine you've built a startup from scratch. You're the CEO, you hold all the power. Suddenly, a huge multinational conglomerate steps in, claiming they're just there to help you transition.
Right.
But immediately, they start giving your employees vastly better health benefits, higher pay, better working conditions. So your employees start looking to the conglomerate, not you.
Yep.
And then the conglomerate tells you that to keep your CEO title, you have to run for it in an open election against other candidates.
And that analogy hits their fourth apprehension perfectly, the fear of democracy.
Right, because they were an armed group, not politicians.
Exactly. The LTTE operated on a very strict authoritarian command structure.
Right.
Orders were given and they were followed, period.
Right.
The accord mandated a transition to democratic governance, where the ballot box would eventually determine who controlled the northern and eastern provinces.
They knew perfectly well how to conduct an ambush, but setting up campaign offices, debating policy.
That's a totally different skill set. Authoritarian control versus electoral uncertainty is a massive psychological leap.
Yeah, they were terrified that in a free and fair election, they might actually lose to other Tamil political groups.
Exactly. And that fear of rival groups ties directly into their fifth and final core apprehension, which is this profound institutional distrust of Indian intelligence.
Right. The source mentions RNAW specifically.
Yes, the Research and Analysis Wing, which is India's external intelligence agency.
Okay.
The LTTE harbored these incredibly deep suspicions that RNAW was actively instigating, funding, and arming rival Tamil militant groups, specifically to undermine the LTTE's dominance.
Wow. Okay, so if we look at the board purely from the LTTE's perspective for a minute.
Yeah, lay it out.
Your core objective of independence is legally outlawed. Your military prestige is being stripped away. Your civilian support is being bought by foreign soldiers. You're being forced into elections you aren't sure you can win. And you genuinely believe the Peacekeepers' intelligence wing is secretly arming your rivals.
When you lay it out exactly like that, the collapse of the agreement isn't a surprise at all, is it? It's an absolute inevitability.
It really is. The paranoia was just absolute.
And paranoia always demands action. The LTTE recognized that they needed to physically and psychologically separate the local population from the Indian peacekeepers.
So they demanded that all financial and material assistance promised by the Indian government be formalized on paper, which the Indian Army actually did, but it was just too late.
Way too late. The LTTE had already decided to initiate the trust breakdown model.
Okay, so how does that model actually work on the ground? Like, how do you pivot from signing a peace treaty to open hostility without looking like the bad guy to your own people?
Well, it rarely starts with a massive explosion, right? You don't just start shooting peacekeepers on day one.
Right, that would ruin the narrative.
Exactly. A trust breakdown is incremental. It begins with small procedural disagreements, and then you weaponize those disagreements to breed suspicion.
Okay.
That suspicion allows you to launch a narrative battle. And once you win the narrative battle, the population is primed to accept the physical confrontation that eventually follows.
Right, so it's a strategy of grievance.
Yeah.
The LTTE systematically began raising all these objections to the peace process. But looking closely at the sources, the goal wasn't actually to resolve the objections, was it?
No, not at all. The goal was to use the objections as proof to the civilian population that the IPKF was secretly allied with the Sinhalese government and therefore hostile to the Tamils.
It is just brilliant, cynical asymmetry.
Okay.
And the tragic irony here is that simultaneously, the Sri Lankan government in Colombo was accusing the IPKF of the exact opposite. Right. They were claiming the peacekeepers were secretly favoring the LTTE by allowing them to drag their feet on surrendering their weapons.
Exactly. The IPKF was just caught in this incredibly tight vice of competing paranoias from both sides.
So let's break down the three major objections the LTTE used to just grind the implementation to a halt. The first one involves the Sri Lankan Armed Forces, the SLAF, and specifically where they were sleeping.
Right. So, under the terms of the accord, the SLAF was required to vacate public buildings, so schools, hospitals, community centers, and return to the barracks and positions they held prior to the major military offensives of May 1987.
Okay, simple enough. But they were dragging their feet.
Well, from the SLAF's perspective, it was a total logistical nightmare.
Right, moving an army isn't easy.
Exactly. You have thousands of troops, and you need to find secure alternate accommodations for them before you can just march them out of a reinforced hospital. It takes a lot of time.
But the LTTE completely ignored that logistical reality.
Completely. They seized on the delay and framed it to the Tamil public as a deliberate, malicious violation of the accord. They pointed at the troops still in the schools and said, look, they have absolutely no intention of leaving. This peace is a trap.
Wow, okay, and the second objection is even more volatile because it touches on this really raw nerve of geography and demographics.
The Eastern Province?
Right. During the height of the ethnic violence between 1983 and 1987, a lot of Sinhala families were terrified and fled their farms and homes in the east.
And now that a peace accord is signed, those internally displaced Sinhala families want to go back home.
Which seems completely logical. The war is supposedly over. Go back to your farm.
Legally and ethically, yes, absolutely. The Sri Lankan government was processing their return entirely transparently. But remember, the LTTE's fourth apprehension.
The fear of elections.
Right. There was a massive region-defining referendum scheduled for 1988 to decide whether the northern and eastern provinces would permanently merge.
Oh, wow. So the LTTE looked at these returning Sinhala families and immediately declared it a vast demographic conspiracy.
Exactly. They claim the government was deliberately importing Sinhalese voters into the East to tamper with the upcoming referendum and artificially defeat the merger.
So literally everything is interpreted through the lens of an existential threat.
Everything. But the third objection, the prisoner dilemma, this is where we see a true unbreakable deadlock. This is where the diplomatic gears just snap completely.
It really is a profound example of how legal technicalities, when fueled by distrust, can completely derail a peace process.
Oh, definitely. So during the years of insurgency, Sri Lankan security forces had captured and imprisoned roughly 1,200 Tamils, including many hardcore LTTE personnel.
And the peace accord explicitly granted a general amnesty to all combatants, right?
Yes.
So amnesty means amnesty. The ink is dry, open the cell doors.
That was the LTTE's position, naturally. But the Sri Lankan government, acting as a sovereign legal entity, countered that.
Okay, what was their counter?
They pointed out that some of these 1,200 prisoners had ongoing criminal cases related to non-political offenses. Like, they weren't just being held for insurgency, there were serious allegations of common crimes mixed in there.
So they couldn't just open the doors blindly.
Right. The government stated they needed time to properly vet the individual files. And additionally, the government demanded that the LTTE release 8 Sri Lankan policemen they were currently holding hostage.
You give us our 8 cops back and we'll process your guys. I mean, that sounds like pretty standard negotiation.
It is.
And the government even offered a shortcut, right? They told the LTTE, if you just give us a list of the specific high-value prisoners you actually care about, we will pull their files, fast-track the vetting process, and release them immediately.
Yes. Provide a list of names and your men walk free.
And the LTTE flatly refused.
They absolutely refused to write down a single name.
I genuinely struggle to understand the logic there. If you desperately want your commanders out of prison, why would you let them rot in a cell just to avoid handing over a piece of paper?
Because in an environment of zero trust, paperwork is a weapon.
Wow, okay.
The LTTC firmly believed that if they officially handed the Sri Lankan government a list of names, they were providing written, undeniable confirmation that those specific individuals were high-ranking LTTE operatives.
Right.
In their minds, the peace agreement was destined to fail. And when it did fail, they believed that list would serve as a targeted death warrant. The government would know exactly who the most valuable operatives were.
So they demanded a blanket release of all 1,200 people simultaneously with no names attached, just so the government couldn't identify the actual militants hiding among the general suspects.
Exactly. And to apply maximum leverage, the LTTE completely refused to release the 8 hostage policemen until every last Tamil prisoner was freed.
So it results in total paralysis.
Total. You have the issue,
Yep.
prisoners. You have the LTTE perception, fear of targeted execution. You have the government viewpoint, legal due process. The impact is a complete systemic collapse of trust.
Man, so the political and logistical implementation is basically frozen. The trust is gone. And this is where the conflict evolves again.
Right.
It moves away from the diplomatic tables and shifts entirely into the minds of the civilian population. Let's talk about the information warfare campaign, because the sheer scale of what the LTTE built here is staggering.
The source material provides a really fascinating glimpse into the LTTE's administrative capabilities. Over the years, they hadn't just built a militia, they had essentially built a state within a state.
A shadow state.
Yeah, and the crown jewel of that shadow state was a highly sophisticated, incredibly well-funded public relations apparatus. We aren't talking about a few guys handing out, mimeographed flyers in the jungle.
Not at all. In the late 1980s, in the middle of a heavily militarized conflict zone, the LTTE was operating 3 separate Tamil daily newspapers, all printed on their own imported printing presses located right in Jaffna.
It's incredible. They operated a dedicated radio station broadcasting across the Tamil-speaking areas. And even more impressively, they had their own television station beaming LTTE programming directly into the living rooms of Jaffna and the surrounding villages.
How do you even manage the logistics of a television station while fighting a guerrilla war? The satellite equipment, the transmitters, the power generation.
It requires immense resources. And they understood deeply that in an asymmetric conflict like this, information control is directly equivalent to political influence.
Right. If you control the daily news, you control reality for that population.
Exactly. Furthermore, their network wasn't just domestic. They built a highly effective, secure communication grid connecting their leadership in Jaffna with operatives in the capital, Colombo, and across the Palk Strait in Madras, India.
And it stretched globally, too. They had permanent resident representatives stationed in major international hubs, London, Paris, Singapore.
Yeah, these offices were constantly churning out press releases, granting interviews, and feeding the international media a highly curated LTTE-approved narrative of the conflict.
But the source text makes a very pointed, somewhat dark observation about this massive infrastructure, doesn't it?
It does. Running international press offices in European capitals, smuggling in printing presses, operating TV transmitters, it requires a continuous, massive influx of hard currency.
Right.
The text suggests that the existence of such elaborate, expensive facilities tended to confirm long-standing intelligence allegations of a drug connection.
Ah.
It implies that this level of sophisticated operation could only really be sustained under the umbrella of powerful, illicit international patronage.
So whether it was funded by diaspora donations or narcotics, the war chest was overflowing and the media machine was running at full capacity.
Full capacity.
And the moment the peace accord began to wobble, they turned every single barrel of that media machine directly at the Indian peacekeeping force.
The messaging was absolutely relentless. They systematically used their newspapers, radio, and television to denigrate the IPKF. They hammered a single narrative into the population. India is not here out of altruism. India does not care about Tamil suffering.
Right.
India is an imperial power occupying our land strictly for its own selfish geopolitical dominance.
Which is an incredible display of strategic duplicity, honestly.
Yep.
Because while the LTTE's radio stations were blasting India as an evil imperial occupier to the locals behind closed doors, LTTE leadership was secretly making overtures to the Indian government.
It's wild. The LTTE literally offered India full exclusive port facilities at the strategic deep-water harbor of Trincomalee if India would just agree to back the LTTE unequivocally against the Sri Lankan government.
It perfectly illustrates their absolute pragmatism. They were willing to auction off a sovereign nation's premier strategic naval asset to secure foreign military backing, while simultaneously running a massive public relations campaign condemning foreign interference.
Yeah, they operated completely unburdened by hypocrisy.
But despite the barrage of propaganda, the LTTE had a massive problem. The local population was listening to the radio, sure, but they were still eagerly accepting the food, the medicine, and the security provided by the Indian troops.
Right. The civilian dependence on the peacekeepers wasn't breaking yet.
Exactly.
And in any peacekeeping or counterinsurgency operation, the true center of gravity is the support of the local population. The LTTE realized that media broadcasts alone weren't enough to sever that bond.
They needed friction.
Yes, they needed to engineer physical friction. They had to force a confrontation that would make the IPKF react aggressively.
So they pivot to civil mobilization. They start orchestrating massive public meetings, strikes, and processions. And the tactics they use are incredibly cynical. They actually start utilizing children.
Yeah, they would organize large groups of children and women to march to the gates of IPKF military camps to deliver lists of demands.
And they wouldn't just drop off a letter and leave.
No, they would use the sheer mass of the civilian crowd to physically block the entrances and exits of these heavily fortified bases for hours at a time.
It is a calculated provocation. You take heavily armed, highly trained combat soldiers, and you trap them inside their own perimeter using a wall of civilians and children. You're practically daring a stressed, exhausted peacekeeper to make a mistake.
Absolutely. Even the officer in command of the entire IPKF found his own movement blocked at the gates of the Jaffna fort when he was trying to attend a meeting with Prabhakaran.
And the LTTE leadership just shrugged and feigned ignorance, claiming it was a spontaneous civilian uprising.
And eventually, if you strike a match near a powder keg enough times, it detonates. This tactic of provocation inevitably yielded exactly the tragic result the LTTE was hoping for. It culminated in what is known as the Mannar Incident.
Right. Describe what happened at Mannar for us.
So during one of these massive LTTE-orchestrated demonstrations outside the military camp of the 5 Maratha Light Infantry in Mannar, the tension finally snapped. The crowd escalated from just blocking the gate to physically breaking it down and attempting to storm the military compound.
A mob breaking into an active military base.
Exactly. And in the ensuing chaos and, the historical text doesn't provide the forensic details of who fired first or why a single shot rings out. One death occurs in the crowd.
And instantly, the LTTE's media empire seizes on that single casualty. It was the bloody proof they had been trying to manufacture.
Yes. From that day forward, the LTTE's newspapers and radio broadcasts systematically attached a new title to the Indian Army. They relentlessly referred to the IPKF as the killers of Tamils.
The narrative trap snaps shut. The peacekeepers, who arrive to distribute food and ensure security, are now branded as an occupying enemy force.
And once the local population genuinely views the peacekeeper as a lethal threat, the mission is fundamentally irreversibly compromised.
Okay, so we have watched the peace process dissolve into distrust and then into a vicious information war. Now the conflict evolves yet again, entering a phase of deep communal complexity.
Right.
The violence stops being a two-sided political dispute and just shatters into a multi-party, totally unpredictable nightmare.
To understand this phase, we have to zoom in on Trincomalee in the first week of September 1987. If you want a geographic definition of a flashpoint, Trincomalee is it.
Set the scene for us.
The demographics of the district were split almost perfectly into thirds. 1/3 Sinhala, 1/3 Tamil, and 1/3 Muslim.
And hovering over this incredibly delicate demographic balance is the impending 1988 referendum. The vote that will decide if the northern and eastern provinces actually merge into a single administrative unit.
The electoral math in Trincomalee made it the ultimate battleground. The Sinhala population was overwhelmingly expected to vote against the merger. The Tamil population was overwhelmingly expected to vote for it.
So they essentially cancel each other out.
Exactly. The entire geopolitical future of the region rested on the Muslim community. They were the ultimate tiebreakers.
Right.
Logically, from a political standpoint, the Tamil community should have been doing everything in their power to woo the Muslim voters, to build a coalition and secure their support for the merger.
But instead of coalition building, we see a sudden explosion of terror. Armed militant groups wearing LTTE uniforms systematically begin attacking and terrorizing Muslim neighborhoods in Trincomalee.
Right. Muslims are massacred. The immediate predictable result is the absolute alienation of the Muslim community from the Tamil cause.
But wait, why would the LTTE intentionally alienate the exact voting bloc they needed to win the referendum?
Well, this is where we encounter the fog of war and competing narratives. The LTTE immediately released statements claiming total innocence. They argued that these massacres were a highly orchestrated false flag operation.
Oh, false flag.
Yeah, they claimed it was actually Sinhalese police commandos disguised in LTTE uniforms committing the murders specifically to drive a wedge between the Tamil and Muslim minorities.
But the Sinhala community offered a completely different, much darker explanation, didn't they?
They did. They argued that the LTTE had already run the polling numbers. The LTTE realized the Muslim community was likely going to vote against the merger anyway. So rather than waste time trying to persuade them politically, the LTTE decided to use raw terror to physically drive the entire Muslim population out of the province before the referendum could even take place.
Demographic clearing by force.
Exactly. But regardless of whether it was a false flag operation or a campaign of ethnic cleansing, the reality on the ground was utter chaos. Communities were turning on each other. The police intensified their patrols. A battalion of the Central Reserve Police Force, the CRPF, was rushed into the area.
Right. Community leaders held marathon, desperate meetings trying to calm the tempers, but the violence just spiraled out of control.
And the IPKF, the supposedly impartial peacekeepers, are trapped right in the middle of this three-way crossfire.
The text outlines some of the bizarre, chaotic incidents they faced. Like in one instance, a civilian van suddenly opens fire on an Indian Army patrol. The peacekeepers return fire, give chase, and the van speeds away and drives straight inside a Sri Lankan armed forces camp for protection.
Yeah. And in another incident, a lone gunman in civilian clothes fires on an IPKF patrol, turns, and sprints behind the fortified gates of another SLAF base.
This creates an impossible, maddening security dilemma for the Indian troops.
Wow.
You have Sinhala civilians shooting Tamils, Tamils shooting Sinhala, someone is massacring Muslims, and unidentified militants are taking pot shots at the Indian Army and then literally hiding behind the barricades of the host nation's military.
It is the absolute definition of a deteriorating security environment, and this localized violence rapidly generated massive political pressure at the national level.
Right. Colombo starts leaning on them.
Yeah. The Sri Lankan government in Colombo is watching Sinhala civilians being killed. They turn to the Indian military leadership and say, "You are failing in your mandate to protect our citizens. We demand that you allow our troops, the SLAF, to leave their barracks and restore order in Trincomalee."
Which puts the IPKF in a completely lose-lose situation.
Absolutely.
If they agree and they let the Sri Lankan army hit the streets, they are explicitly violating the core terms of the peace accord, which strictly confined the SLAF to their barracks.
Right. And furthermore, the second a Sri Lankan soldier steps out with a rifle, the LTTE's media machine will scream that the Indian Army has officially joined forces with the Sinhalese government to oppress and butcher the Tamils.
But if they say no, the communal violence continues, and the Sri Lankan government accuses India of complicity in the murder of Sinhalese civilians.
In a complex security dilemma, a defensive measure taken by one actor is immediately perceived as an existential offensive threat by another. The IPKF made the only choice they legally could. They had to enforce the accord. They told the host nation's army to stand down.
They literally had to point their weapons at the army of the sovereign nation that had invited them in.
Yeah. A massive firefight was barely averted when the SLAF attempted to move a military unit from Vuvunya to reinforce Trincomalee. The IPKF's 340 Infantry Brigade had to physically deploy and block their line of advance.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
The tension escalated to an almost cinematic level. On another occasion, the Sri Lankan military attempted to fly troop reinforcements directly into the Trincomalee airstrip.
Right.
And the officer in command of the IPKF made a split-second, incredibly aggressive decision. He ordered Indian heavy tanks to roll out directly onto the runway to physically block the Sri Lankan transport flights from landing.
Just visualize that for a second. Indian tanks obstructing Sri Lankan aircraft on a sovereign runway, while LTTE guerrillas watch from the surrounding jungles and the city burns with communal violence.
The entire peace process is hanging by a single thread. And yet, while all this public chaotic violence is dominating the headlines, the true fate of the accord is being decided in the shadows.
It is. The preparations for a full-scale war are already well underway.
And this is a crucial lesson in intelligence and intent indicators. If you want to know if a peace agreement is going to survive, ignore the press conferences, ignore the political speeches, look at the logistics, look at what the combatants are buying.
Exactly. In early September 1987, Indian military intelligence starts flagging incredibly strange, seemingly mundane anomalies in the local markets.
Right.
There are massive, unprecedented spikes in the sales of two specific, incredibly boring items: industrial grease and heavy polythene sheeting.
To a civilian or a politician, a spike in grease sales means nothing. But to a seasoned military intelligence officer, it is a glaring neon red flag.
Absolutely.
Why does an insurgent group suddenly need vast quantities of thick grease and waterproof plastic? Because they have absolutely no intention of handing over their arsenal.
None. They are heavily greasing their rifles and mortars, wrapping them tightly in polythene and burying them deep underground to cache them.
They were hiding their heavy weapons from IPKF search patrols, actively preserving their combat power for the war they knew was coming, all while publicly blaming the ongoing violence on rival factions.
It is the logistics of deception. And then, in mid-September, the intelligence picture sharpens dramatically. Information surfaces regarding a specific LTTE maritime vessel, a ship named the Ileana.
The Ileana is executing a massive, highly sophisticated illegal arms smuggling operation right under the noses of the Indian Navy.
Yeah. This ship originates in Singapore and brings a massive consignment: 700 assault rifles, huge stockpiles of ammunition, and heavy explosives.
And the maritime logistics required to pull this off are intense. To avoid detection at formal ports or by naval patrols, the Ileana doesn't dock.
Right.
It halts out in the deep waters of the high seas. The cargo's 700 rifles is painstakingly offloaded onto a fleet of smaller, faster fiberglass boats bobbing in the open ocean.
And those small boats then scatter and smuggle the weapons into hidden, shallow coves along the jagged Sri Lankan coastline.
And the Indian Navy actually pieces this puzzle together. They eventually track down and locate the empty mothership, the Ileana, docked far away in Rangoon Harbor in Burma.
The connection is undeniable. The massive influx of new weapons coming in from the sea perfectly explains why LTTE operatives were buying out all the grease and polythene in the local markets on land.
You do not import 700 assault rifles, execute a complex high-seas cargo transfer, and purchase industrial quantities of grease to bury them if you intend to honor a ceasefire.
No, these are absolute intent indicators. The logistics proved, beyond any doubt, that the LTTE was actively preparing for a prolonged, intense military conflict.
So the weapons are buried, the population is radicalized, the communal violence is tearing cities apart. The military reality on the ground is that a war has already begun.
Yeah.
But in a desperate, 11th hour attempt to stave off the inevitable, the politicians decide to make one final push. They try to save the peace through a massive transfer of political power.
The Interim Administrative Council.
Right. Let's examine the political breakdown in the doomed IAC.
From a diplomatic standpoint, the immediate critical requirement was to initiate a political transition to civilian rule. The framework called for the creation of an all-party interim administrative council.
And this council would basically take over the day-to-day local administration of the northern and eastern provinces.
Exactly. It was designed to be the crucial stepping stone, the stabilizing body, before holding free and fair democratic elections.
So in late September 1987, after exhausting marathon negotiations spearheaded by the High Commissioner of India, a formula is finally agreed upon. It's an 11-member council.
Right.
And frankly, the Sri Lankan government bends over backward here. The LTTE is offered an incredibly sweet deal.
They were basically handed the keys to the region. Out of the 11 seats on the council, the LTTE is granted the absolute right to nominate 6 members, giving them an outright majority, and one of those 6 had to be a Muslim representative.
And the remaining 5 seats?
They would be divided, 2 for Sinhala members and 2 for the TULF.
We should probably define the TULF quickly for the listeners.
Sure, the Tamil United Liberation Front. They were a moderate, mainstream Tamil political party. They advocated for Tamil rights through the political and legal system rather than armed insurgency.
So the LTTE viewed them as rivals, obviously, but they were still given 2 seats.
Right. But the real prize was the chairmanship of the council. The agreed-upon formula was that the LTTE would submit a short list of 3 names for the chairman position. The president of Sri Lanka would then select one of those 3 names to lead the government.
Okay, that seems fair.
Furthermore, the president agreed to officially delegate his own executive powers directly to this chairman, and crucially, the council would be given full responsibility for maintaining law and order.
It was a massive, historic concession of executive and police power directly to the militant group.
Huge. So on September 28th, the Indian High Commissioner flies to the military air base at Palali. Prabhakaran and his senior LTTE leadership are brought in. The LTTE had submitted their 3 names for chairman. The Sri Lankan president reviews the list and selects a man named Mr. Sivanyanam, a respected figure who hailed from Jaffna.
Okay, so the president picks a name from the LTTE's own list. It should be a done deal.
It should be, but Prabhakaran immediately objects.
Wait, what?
Yeah. He suddenly demands that the president ignore Sivanyanam and instead choose his third option, a man named Mr. N. Pathmanathan, who is from the eastern province.
Why?
Well, the president of Sri Lanka flatly refuses. From the government's perspective, Pathmanathan was completely unacceptable. He had a documented history of involvement in terrorist activities and was considered way too junior in political stature to be handed massive executive powers over 2 provinces.
So you have this incredibly tense, high-stakes standoff at the Palali Air Base.
Very tense.
The Indian High Commissioner is pleading. The LTTE is arguing. Finally, after hours of heated, exhausting debate, Prabhakaran relents. He agrees to the president's choice of Sivanyanam. He physically signs the agreement. The council is formed.
And this is the moment the political process suffers a fatal, self-inflicted blow. Prabhakaran signs the paper. The diplomatic victory is achieved.
Okay.
But at midnight that exact same day, the LTTE completely reverses course. They issue a statement formally withdrawing from the agreement their leader had signed just hours earlier.
Why? I mean, structurally, why walk away from a deal where you hold the majority of seats, you control the executive power, and you control the police force? It defies logical political strategy.
To understand why they walked away from total political victory, we have to look past the council and analyze their long-term calculus.
Okay.
The source provides 4 distinct, fascinating reasons for this midnight reversal. First, we return to that core apprehension, the paralyzing fear of fighting an election.
Right, we talked about that.
They knew how to govern through force. They did not know how to govern through consensus. They feared the council was just a trap that would inevitably lead to a vote they might lose.
Makes sense. What's the second reason?
Second, there was a severe internal fracture developing within the LTTE itself. A schism was growing between their military wing, the hardened field commanders, and their political wing. The military commanders fiercely disagreed with the political compromises being made in Palali.
Okay, so internal politics.
Exactly. The third reason reveals their grand strategic vision. The LTTE leadership had concluded that if they could manufacture absolute chaos, widespread civil disobedience, unmanageable internal strife, relentless violence, they could eventually break the political will of the Indian government.
Well, they wanted to exhaust them.
Right. They wanted to force the IPKF to simply give up and sail back to India.
And once the Indian army is out of the way, the LTTE is left alone to fight the Sri Lankan military. And crucially, in 1987, the Sri Lankan military was highly vulnerable, weren't they?
Precisely. The Sri Lankan armed forces were heavily committed in the deep south of the island, fighting a completely separate, incredibly violent Marxist-Leninist uprising led by a group called the JVP, the Janatha Vimukthi Peramuna. The JVP was paralyzing the Sinhalese south. The LTTE calculated that if they forced India out, they could launch a massive offensive in the north, trapping the Sri Lankan government in a brutal two-front war.
They believed the pressure would fracture the state, forcing Colombo to grant Tamil Eelam just to survive.
It is a breathtakingly ruthless, high-stakes military gamble.
It really is.
But the fourth reason for the midnight reversal is perhaps the most profound piece of psychological insight in this entire history. The source refers to it as the age factor.
The age factor. Okay, break that down for me.
This is a chilling look into strategic patience. The top leadership cadre of the LTTE, including Prabhakaran, were young men. They were mostly in their early 30s.
Early 30s. Okay.
When they sat down and looked at the timeline of the conflict, they felt that biological time was entirely on their side.
Wow. They literally did the math and concluded, we can afford to reject this peace deal.
Exactly. They figured, we can plunge this region back into a brutal insurgency, we can fight in the jungles, sustain heavy losses, and wage war for another 15 to 20 years. And by the time we finally win our independent state, we will still only be in our early 50s. We have our whole lives ahead of us.
When one side of a negotiation is perfectly willing to sacrifice 2 decades of peace and thousands of lives simply because they feel they have the youth to wait out their enemies, I mean, political compromise is structurally impossible.
It is. The LTTE's duplicity completely destroyed the Indian government's ability to support the Tamil minority politically.
So the political process is officially dead. The negotiations at Pallali were just a mirage. And now the conflict shifts from tense diplomacy and secret logistics into a realm of raw, uncontrollable emotion and martyrdom.
We are entering the phase of psychological turning points.
Even while those doomed negotiations for the Administrative Council were happening, a highly orchestrated, emotionally devastating crisis was unfolding in Jafta, wasn't it?
Yes. On September 15th, 1987, the LTTE's chief of propaganda, a man named Thurley Pan, began a public fast unto death at the historic Nellore Temple.
A hunger strike, but not a symbolic one. He intended to die.
He did. And he laid out 5 very specific demands to the Indian government to halt his fast.
What were they?
He demanded a complete halt to all Sinhalese colonization in Tamil areas that was occurring under the guise of state rehabilitation.
Okay.
He demanded the immediate release of all Tamil prisoners held under the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act. He demanded the immediate formation of the Interim Administrative Council and a halt to all civic rehabilitation until it was formed. He demanded the SLAF physically vacate all school and college buildings. And finally, he demanded that the government permanently disarms the Sinhalese home guards under the supervision of the Indian Army.
These demands are a highly potent mixture of legitimate ongoing grievances and, frankly, impossible political ultimatums.
Exactly.
And as the days ticked by, Thilipan, who was already a revered figure as a propaganda chief, began to physically waste away in public view. The emotional temperature of the Tamil population just skyrocketed.
It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. His slow deterioration became a powerful, inescapable, symbolic rallying point.
And then, on September 26th, Thilipan dies.
He dies. And his martyrdom creates a massive, unbridgeable emotional chasm. It fundamentally severed the psychological connection between the Sri Lankan Tamils and India.
Whatever lingering goodwill the ITKF had earned through their clinics and food rations just evaporated in an instant.
Instantly. The Indian army was now viewed by the population as directly complicit in his death, simply because they did not use military force to compel the Sri Lankan government to meet his demands.
Thilipan's death provided the underlying explosive emotional tension. The powder keg was completely full. But an explosion still requires a spark.
It does.
And what happens next is the absolute textbook definition of a trigger event.
October 3rd, 1987. Out on the ocean. The Sri Lankan Navy is conducting a routine maritime patrol. They intercept a boat moving through Sri Lankan territorial waters. They board the vessel and find 17 LTTE personnel.
But these aren't low-level recruits moving supplies.
No. Among the 17 captured are absolute top-tier leaders. Kamarpa, who was the regional military commander of Jaffna, and Pulendran, the regional commander of Trincomalee.
The two highest-ranking field commanders in the region?
Yes.
Oh.
And their capture instantly sparks a massive, incredibly tense legal and jurisdictional dispute.
I can imagine.
The LTTE is furious. They argue that because of the peace agreement's general amnesty, the capture and detention of these commanders is totally illegal. They demand the men be handed over to the Indian peacekeepers immediately.
But the Sri Lankan armed forces hold their ground, right? And they deploy a very specific, airtight legal counter-argument.
They do. They state that the amnesty provision only pardoned offenses committed prior to the signing date of August 30th, 1987. They argue these men were committing a brand new crime on October 3rd, smuggling weapons, or attempting to leave the country without valid travel documents. Furthermore, they note that Pulendran's alleged new offenses occurred outside the specific geographic zone where the amnesty legally applied.
And beyond the amnesty date, there's a whole jurisdictional issue, too. Because they were captured at sea by the Sri Lankan Navy, the SLAF maintains these men are entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Indian peacekeepers on the land.
Right. The president of Sri Lanka gets directly involved. He remains absolutely adamant the men will not be released to the IPKF. They will be flown to the capital, Colombo, for intense interrogation.
The only minor concession the president makes to the desperate Indian diplomats is a promise that the men will not be physically tortured and they will not be humiliatingly paraded on state television.
So for 2 agonizing days, the tension is just unbearable. The 17 LTTE commanders are held under heavy guard at the military airbase at Palali. The LTTE is threatening absolute fire and brimstone if they are moved.
The Indian military leadership is scrambling, trying desperately to mediate a solution before the situation explodes.
And then on October 5th, the catalyst ignites.
Walk us through it.
Sri Lankan military guards escort the 17 LTTE prisoners out of their holding cells. They walk them across the open tarmac toward a waiting military aircraft that will fly them south to Colombo.
And right there, on the tarmac, before they can be loaded onto the plane, all 17 men simultaneously bite down on glass cyanide capsules they had managed to keep hidden on their persons.
All 17 men commit suicide on the spot.
It's an unimaginable shock to the system. The regional commanders of Jaffna and Trincomalee dead on an airstrip. The trigger has been pulled.
The LTTE's reaction to this mass suicide is swift, and it is unimaginably savage. The transition to violence is immediate.
Over 200 Sinhalese civilians are massacred in immediate coordinated retaliation across the region. More than 10,000 people are suddenly rendered homeless as villages burn.
And remember those 8 Sinhala policemen the LTTE had been holding hostage for months? The ones that caused the initial prisoner deadlock?
Yeah.
On October 6th, the day after the cyanide suicides, the LTTE executes all 8 of them.
And the manner of their execution is a direct, calculated, visceral message. The LTTE drives a van up to the gates of the Jaffna fort, right in full view of the Indian Army battalion stationed inside. And they literally dump the bodies of the executed policemen onto the street.
It is a visual declaration of war against the Sri Lankan state and a profound, blood-soaked insult to the impotence of the Indian peacekeepers.
The security environment completely, totally collapses.
It does. The IPKF is forced to urgently deploy small subunits across the countryside just to protect isolated Sri Lankan army camps because the Sri Lankan troops are stretched far too thin fighting the JVP insurgency in the south.
Right. Seeing the rapid, catastrophic deterioration, the Indian Army leadership realizes they are losing control of the theater. They urgently order the headquarters of the 36th Infantry Division to fly directly into Trincomalee to assume emergency control of the eastern province.
The peace is officially dead. The peacekeeping phase is over. The military enforcement phase is about to begin. We have reached the point of the hard option.
October 6th and 7th become a frantic flurry of high-level military and political meetings. The Indian Chief of Army Staff, General K. Sundarji, flies into Palali to assess the disaster. He and the Indian Defense Minister then travel urgently to Colombo to meet face-to-face with the President of Sri Lanka.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the officer in command of the IPKF and the general officer commanding the 54th Infantry Division make one final desperate attempt.
What do?
They try to secure a meeting with the LTTE leadership, hoping to make them see reason to step back from the brink of total war. But the LTTE refuses to engage. The outreach completely fails.
And so, the Rubicon is crossed. On October 7th, 1987, Direct, historic instructions are beamed from the Chief of Army Staff in Colombo down to the IPKF field headquarters. The order is given. Use force against the LTTE. Disarm them by any means necessary.
But looking at the source material, the text provides a really critical, sobering analysis of this specific decision. Looking at the raw military reality on the ground, the decision to adopt the hard option and use military force seems tragically premature.
It raises a profound question regarding the intersection of political pressure and military decision-making.
It really does. The text outlines 3 massive structural flaws in the timing of this escalation. First, diplomatic and indirect pressure on the LTTE had not been fully exhausted. There were other levers of statecraft and economic pressure to pull before resorting to open combat in heavily populated areas.
Right. And second, the logistics were a nightmare. The APKF simply did not have adequate troop strength on the ground to fight a full-scale counterinsurgency war.
No, they lacked the necessary number of combat formations. Even the units they did have were severely under strength because a full national military mobilization hadn't been formally declared in India yet. Headquarters 36th Division had literally just landed in Trincomalee. They weren't prepared for an offensive.
And third, the strategic reality. The political leadership failed to recognize the magnitude of the order. They thought they were authorizing a localized police action to round up some militants.
Right. They didn't realize they were committing the Indian Army to be trapped in a brutal, protracted, bleeding guerrilla insurgency in a foreign jungle for the next several years.
But the order is given. The machinery of war grinds into motion, and the opening salvos are fired on October 9th and 10th. The IPKF launches a series of operations they call demonstration raids.
The objective of a demonstration raid is highly specific. It is designed to show overwhelming resolve and capability, to intimidate the opponent into compliance without necessarily triggering a full, uncontrolled war. And crucially, to avoid any accusation of political partiality, the Indian forces didn't just target the LTTE. They simultaneously raided the camps of other rival militant groups. In these initial sweeps, they captured 131 militants, along with dozens of weapons, ammunition stockpiles, and explosives.
And on the morning of October 10th, they launch a highly targeted strike right in the heart of Jaffna town. They go after the LTTE's true center of gravity, their information network.
Exactly. Indian troops physically raid and destroy the LTTE's printing presses. They smash the equipment and they render the radio stations and television transmission facilities completely ineffective.
They neutralize the media empire in a matter of hours. They silence the propaganda machine.
But if the military leadership thought that destroying the printing presses would silence the LTTE's guns, they were catastrophically wrong. The transition from limited, demonstrative action to open, unrestrained conflict was instantaneous.
Later, that exact same day, October 10th, the LTTE unleashes a massive, coordinated wave of retaliation across the entire region. They attack the 5 Madras military post at Telapalai, pinning the peacekeepers down with heavy mortars and sustain small arms fire.
They execute a lethal ambush on a CRPF police convoy, moving between Telapalai and Paravillian, killing 4 Jawans.
They engage a foot patrol of the 1 Maratha Light Infantry with heavy, concentrated fire as the soldiers try to return to the safety of the Jaffna fort.
And in a particularly brutal, symbolic incident that signaled the true nature of the war to come, they hijack a military jeep belonging to the Elite 10 Para-Regiment. They execute the 5 paratroopers inside, and they completely destroy the vehicle.
The peace enforcement phase has violently, irrevocably transitioned into a shooting war. The complex, delicate web of the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord has completely burned to the ground. The peacekeepers are now combatants.
So we have walked through the timeline, the tragedy, and the escalation. We've seen the mechanics of how peace fails. Now, let's step back and look at the answer frameworks. What does this all mean for you, the listener?
Right. Whether you are trying to make sense of international conflict resolution, studying military history, or even managing complex negotiations in your own life, we need to extract the core, actionable lessons from this historical deep dive.
Let's do it.
I want to look at the political and negotiation lessons first.
Yeah.
How do you prevent a treaty from becoming a trap?
The primary overriding lesson is that a peace agreement where one party feels they have lost their core prestige and their fundamental objectives is a ticking time bomb.
Yeah.
It will inevitably fail.
Right.
You cannot mandate peace if the psychology of the armed actor interprets the treaty as a humiliating surrender. The LTTE viewed giving up their guns as a loss of identity.
And we saw that with the IAC too, right?
Yes. Furthermore, the LTTE's midnight walkback on the Interim Administrative Council shows us a terrifying truth about negotiations. Long-term strategic calculations, like their belief that their young age gave them a 20-year biological advantage, will always override short-term political concessions.
It doesn't matter how generous the deal is today if the opponent is perfectly willing to fight for 2 decades to get exactly what they want tomorrow.
Exactly.
That makes total sense. You have to understand the opponent's timeline, not just their demands. What about the information and perception lessons? Because the LTTE's media operation was staggering.
The lesson there is absolute. Whoever controls the narrative controls the population. A peacekeeping force can build roads, hand out food, and provide free medical care all day long. But if an insurgency controls the printing presses, the radio waves, and has the ability to seamlessly manufacture grievances like weaponizing a logistical delay in military housing, they will eventually win the battle for the center of gravity.
The IPKF definitively won the initial welfare battle. The people loved them.
Right. But the IPKF catastrophically lost the narrative war after the LTTE exploited highly symbolic emotional incidents like the Mannar shooting and Philippan's fast unto death.
Let's pivot to the intelligence lessons, because the story of the grease, the polythene, and the ship is straight out of a spy novel.
The intelligence lesson is perhaps the most practical. Do not ignore logistical anomalies. Grand strategic intent is rarely announced at a podium. It is revealed in boring, mundane purchases.
Unprecedented spikes in the sale of industrial grease and thick plastic sheeting.
Exactly. Combined with naval intelligence tracking the weapon ship Ileana from Singapore to Rangoon, these were massive, undeniable indicators of intent. They proved structurally that the LTTE was caching heavy weapons and preparing for a massive war, totally contradicting the peace accord they had just signed. In any negotiation, you have to trust the logistics over the rhetoric.
And finally, let's look at the trigger dynamics. How do we understand the actual spark that starts the fire?
We learned the tragic formula for unavoidable escalation. Underlying systemic tension plus a highly emotional catalyst. The underlying tensions had been building for months: the delayed military withdrawals, the demographic fears of returning refugees, the complete deadlock over the prisoner lists.
The system was stressed to the breaking point.
But the catalyst was a hyper-specific legal dispute over maritime jurisdiction and amnesty dates that resulted in 17 top commanders committing suicide with cyanide on an airport tarmac.
Right.
When you combine deep systemic distrust with a highly emotional, violent catalyst, a hard option, military response becomes almost structurally unavoidable. Even if, as the historical analysis points out, that military escalation was tactically premature, logistically flawed, and ultimately plunged the army into a multi-year jungle insurgency.
It is an incredibly sobering map of how human endeavors fall apart. We started with the signing of a hopeful historic accord in Delhi in 1987. We watched the creeping paranoia and distrust take root over the surrender of weapons and the competition for public support. We saw the cynical, brilliant battle for the public mind waged through newspapers, radio, and provoked protests. We witnessed the tragic failure of a massive political compromise at the 11th hour at Palali. And finally, driven by the martyrdom of a hunger strike, the shock of cyanide, and the brutality of massacres, we saw the tragic, brutal inevitability of war.
And I want to leave you with a final lingering thought based on everything we've unpacked today. We saw the LTTE calculate that simply because their leadership was only in their 30s, they could afford to reject a peace deal, walk away from massive political power, and plunge their entire region into 20 more years of devastating war.
Just because they felt they had the time.
They did it simply because they believed biological time was on their side. It forces us to look at modern geopolitics, at the conflicts burning today, and ask a terrifying question. When diplomats and negotiators sit at a table to sign a peace deal, are they actually solving the crisis of today, or are they unknowingly just playing a pawn in someone else's 20-year game?
That is something to chew on, understanding the mechanics of these breakdowns, looking past the diplomatic handshakes and the signed papers to see the grease, the polythene, and the hidden 20-year plans. That is the ultimate shortcut to being truly well-informed. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.